Let's eat.
Leviticus chapter 16, verses 5 to 10 and verses 20 to 22, the Bible talks about a goat that makes atonement for all the sins of the children of Israel by bearing their iniquities and taking all of their iniquities away. And most Bible commentators believe that this is a picture of Christ who takes away the sins of the world. But the Seventh-day Adventists believe that this is a picture of Satan, and they believe that one day Satan will make atonement for the sins of God's people, will bear their iniquities and take their iniquities away. They even believe that Satan will be punished for their sins, and some go so far as to say that Satan will be the one to finally separate God's people from their sins. Verse 10 tells us that this goat makes atonement for the sins of the children of Israel. Is that when you look at verses 20 to 22, it's very clear that this goat bears all of the transgressions, all of the iniquities, and all of the sins of God's people. This animal is not being driven into the wilderness and bearing its own sins, its own transgressions. It's bearing the sins of somebody else. Now let's read verses 20 to 22. It says this, "And when he had made an end of the atoning for the holy place, the tabernacle of meeting, and the altar, he shall bring the live goat. Aaron shall lay both hands on the head of the live goat, confess over it all the iniquities of the children of Israel, and all their transgressions concerning all their sins, putting them on the head of the goat, and shall send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a suitable man. The goat shall bear on itself all their iniquities to an uninhabited land, and he shall release the goat into the wilderness." And I think that this is a representation of the fact that Jesus Christ bore all of our sins, bore all of the guilt, bore the full punishment for our sins, and bore our sins unto death. He died bearing our sins. The desolate place is death. That's what I think is being described here.
Okay, based on Isaiah 53 verse 1, 2, 3, and 4, Jesus is our sin bearer. Now, are we wrong by saying that Satan is also will be a sin bearer in the future? And that is what the Adventist Church believe. They believe that Satan will be a sin bearer as well. But in this video, we're going to compare the two sin bearers, Jesus and Satan. Okay, and we believe that Satan is the scapegoat. He represented by the scapegoat. The scapegoat represents Satan. For the scapegoat will bear the sins of God's people. Let's listen first to EJ Thunder, and then we'll ask the important question, the question that we will answer in this video.
So the question is, are Adventists really comfortable with the thought that Satan atones for their sins, without which they can't be cleansed, erased, and removed? Brothers and sisters, there's so much to logically explore from this Day of Atonement ritual. But these alone already show how egregious, heretical, unscriptural, and unorthodox of the thought that Satan is the scapegoat and sin bearer. The scapegoat, rather, atoned for sin. Atonement was made over it. Without the scapegoat's atonement, sins could not be removed, cleansed, nor erased.
Without the scapegoat's atonement, sins cannot be removed, cleansed, nor erased. Well, let's look at Leviticus 16, verse 20 and verse 21. Listen up. Verse 20, "And when the high priest, when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat." When does the scapegoat come into play in the Day of Atonement? after the high priest finishes, okay, after he makes an end of atoning for the sanctuary and the altar. After atonement is finished at the sanctuary, at the altar, in the tabernacle, that is when the scapegoat comes in. After the sanctuary is cleansed, the scapegoat comes in to play. Okay? It comes in to take its part in the Day of Atonement. Now, verse 21, and Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat, confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel, and all their transgressions, and all their sins, and he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away. There. After the sanctuary is cleansed from all the transgressions, all the sins, all the iniquities of Israel, that's when the scapegoat comes in. And Aaron takes all of that sins that he took out from the sanctuary, that the sanctuary was cleansed, right, of all these sins. And all these sins were placed on the head of the scapegoat. So the question I want to ask is, what kind of sins were placed on the head of the scapegoat? That is the important question. And how can we answer that? Well, by looking at where Aaron, when Aaron puts his hands on the head of the scapegoat. Because, let me read it first. Let me read the text again. And when he has made an end, when he finishes the work of atonement for the holy place, for the tent of meeting and the altar, when he finishes cleansing the sanctuary from all of Israel's sins, he places his hands on the scapegoat. Okay? Hands were placed on the head of the animal after atonement was finished. Okay, look. So what? So this is what? The laying on of hands came after the death of the goat for the Lord and for his people, right? The goat for the Lord is also called the goat for Israel, God's people. After Aaron, how's that? The laying on of hands came after the death of a victim, and after the high priest kills it. Okay, the laying on of hands came after the death of the first goat, the goat for the Lord. After Aaron administers the blood in the sanctuary, Aaron puts his hands on the head of the scapegoat. Okay. With the blood, he purifies or cleansed the sanctuary of all Israel's sins. After that, he places his hands on the head of the scapegoat. I'll just keep repeating it. As a result, atonement was finished. And after atonement was finished, that is when he lays his hands on the head of the scapegoat, symbolically transferring all of Israel's sins on the head of the scapegoat. Okay, so what? This is what? This is in direct contrast to the daily sacrifices, where the sinner laid his hands on the head of the sacrificial victim, the sacrificial animal, and then he kills it. He kills the animal. So the laying on of hands in the daily sacrifice, the daily services, comes before the death of an animal. It comes before the sacrifice of the animal. In the Day of Atonement, it comes after the death of the animal. after atonement was finished, after cleansing has already been done, the high priest lays his hands on the head of the scapegoat. But in the daily sacrifices, the daily services, the laying on of hands comes before the death of the animal, before atonement was made, before forgiveness was made. Okay? Let me read. We're going to go to the text. We're going to pull it out from the text. And I hope it will be very clear. And it will be if you look, if you follow along. Okay, so in the daily sacrifices, the sinner lays his hands on the head of the sacrificial animal before he kills it, not after he kills the animal, he lays his hand. No. Before the animal dies, the sinner, the guilty party, puts his hand on the head of the animal. Before atonement was made for him, his hand was placed on the head of the animal. Before he was forgiven, his hand was placed on the head of the animal. Total opposite with what's going on in the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, hands were laid on the head of the scapegoat after the death of the first goat, after atonement was finished in the sanctuary. After all of that, Aaron places his hands on the head of the scapegoat, symbolically transferring all of Israel's sins on the head of the scapegoat. Now, let me read Leviticus chapter 4, verse 13 all the way to 20. I'm going to share this example, okay, of how the laying on of hands come before the death of the sacrificial animal, comes before the atonement of the sinner for the sinner, comes before forgiveness for the sinner. Okay, this is when the congregation of Israel sins. They bring their sin offering. Here, Leviticus 4, verses 13 all the way to 20. I read, "If the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally, and the thing is hidden from the eyes of the assembly, and they do any one of the things that by the Lord's commandments ought not to be done, and they realize their guilt when the sin which they have committed becomes known, the assembly shall offer a bull from the herd for a sin offering and bring it in front of the tent of meeting." Verse 15, "And the elders of the congregation shall lay their hands on the head of the bull before the Lord." So the laying on of hands comes first. Next, after they lay their hands on the head of the bull, what comes next? "And the bull shall be killed before the Lord." Death comes after the laying on of hands. Verse 16, "Then the anointed priest shall bring some of the blood of the bull into the tent of meeting." Verse 17, "And the priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil." Verse 18, "And he shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar that is in the tent of meeting before the Lord, and the rest of the blood he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering that is at the entrance of the tent of meeting." Verse 19, "And all its fat he shall take from it and burn on the altar." Verse 20, "Thus shall he do with the bull, as he did with the bull of the sin offering. So shall he do with this, and the priest shall make atonement." Atonement is made after the laying on of hands, after the death of the animal. Okay? "And the priest shall make atonement for them, and they shall be forgiven." So what comes first? The guilty party lays their hands. Okay, the elders in this passage, when the congregation sins, they bring their sin offering, and the elders lay their hands on the head of the bull. After they lay their hands on the head of the bull is killed. Okay, death comes after the laying on of hands. After that, atonement is made. After that, they shall be forgiven. So forgiveness, atonement, and the death of the animal, they all come after the laying on of hands. This is the same for the common Israelite citizen who sins. He brings his own individual sacrificial animal. He lays his hands on the head, and the animal is killed. Atonement is made after that, and then forgiveness comes after. Look, let's visualize what I've just shared in a diagram for you visual learners, okay? So, laying on of hands in the scapegoat ritual, death comes first, then blood is administered in the tent. Atonement is finished, then the sanctuary is cleansed from sins. After that, after the sanctuary is cleansed, the priest comes out and lay both his hands on the head of the scapegoat. And the scapegoat carries all the sins of Israel into the wilderness. Okay? But on the daily sacrifices, laying on of hands in sin offering ritual for priests and congregation, okay? First, the guilty party or their representatives lay their hands on the head of the animal. After they lay their hands on the head of the animal is killed. Okay, what does the laying on of hands represent? What does that mean? It represents the transfer of sin from the guilty party to the substitute. That's what Jesus did. He died in our place. Jesus bore our sin. The sinner put his hand on the head of the animal, and that is a symbol of his guilt. His sins are transferred to the animal. And what is the penalty for sin? Death. The animal dies in his place. Okay? After the death of the animal, what happens next? Blood is taken into the tent, sprinkled in the tent, and sprinkled at the bronze altar, the altar of sacrifice. After that has been done, then atonement was made for the priest or for the congregation, and the congregation is forgiven. So forgiveness comes after the laying on of hands. Forgiveness comes after the death of the animal. And then after that, the rest of the sin offering, the rest of the animal was burned. The body of the animal was burned outside the camp. All right? Now, the laying on of hands in sin offering rituals for rulers and common people, it's the same thing. The guilty person lays his hands on the animal. After that, he kills the animal. After that, blood is taken into the blood is sprinkled, scattered on the altar of sacrifice, and also blood was spilled at the bottom of the altar of sacrifice. And atonement comes after the death of the animal. Atonement was made for the ruler, for the common person. Forgiveness was now forgiveness takes place after the death of the animal, after atonement was made, after the laying on of hands. So what does this mean? Okay, just by looking at this diagram, it helps us understand what kind of sins the scapegoat bore into the wilderness. Right? Look at the diagram. All the sins every day, Sinners comes in, they lay their hands on the sacrificial animal, they kill the animal. When they lay their hands on the head of their animals, there's is symbolically or represents that their sins were transferred to the head of that animal. Then that animal dies in his place. Okay. The priest takes the blood into the sanctuary, the tabernacle. It represents that their sins was transferred from the animal to the sanctuary. Some went into the tent. Some of the blood were splattered on the altar of sacrifice. That is why on the Day of Atonement, the blood of the goat for the Lord was used to cleanse the tent and the altar of sacrifice. Why? Because sins were transferred into the tent and on the altar of sacrifice. So the high priest goes in with the blood of the goat for the Lord and cleanses the tent and the altar of sacrifice, and takes all that iniquity that was gathered throughout the year, right? Takes all their sins, iniquities, and transgressions from the sanctuary and place them on the head of the scapegoat. So, what kind of sins were placed on the head of the scapegoat? The goat shall bear all their iniquities on itself to a remote area, and he shall let go free in the wilderness. What kind of sins do the scapegoat bear to the wilderness? All sins that were already atoned for. All sins that were already forgiven. Those sins that were already atoned for, already forgiven, were placed on the head of the scapegoat. And the scapegoat carries that kind of sin into the wilderness. Questions? Comments? In the comment section. Hit the like button and subscribe. And hit the bell. Okay, see you on the next one. Peace and God bless.